The bread had cooled by the time the sun cleared the feed store roof. 6 loaves lined along the windowsill of the bakehouse, and one of them sat 2 inches from a groove, cut fresh into the wood. The bullet had gone in low, taken a splinter the length of a finger, and stopped somewhere in the wall behind. Flour dust still hung faint in the light, settling on the sill, on the cooling loaves, on the grays in the wood like it meant to bury the evidence of the night before it could be asked about. She knelt on the porch step with a strip of muslin in her hands, torn from the hem of her apron, and wound it around his forearm where the second bullet had gone. Not into the wood, not into the bread, but into him, a shallow furrow above the wrist that had bled enough to darken the cuff of his shirt before she'd pressed the cloth to it. He sat with his rifle across his knees, same as any of the nights before, except the barrel was still warm and his coat was open, and he wasn't watching the road anymore. He was watching her hands. They were floured. She hadn't stopped to wash them, hadn't stopped for anything since the shooting quit and the hoofbeats faded east toward the herd line, and now she worked the muslin around his arm, with white prints left behind on his sleeve, on his wrist, on the cloth itself. Neither of them spoke. Down the lane, a dog barked twice and quit. The rail yard whistle hadn't sounded yet, too early, and the town of Larkspur Hollow lay the way it always did before 6, doors shut, windows dark, nobody yet knowing what had happened on the porch of the bakehouse while they slept. By supper they would know. That was how it worked here. But for now it was only the 2 of them, the bread, the grays in the sill, and the grays in his arm, and the quiet that comes after a thing has ended, but before anyone has found the words to carry it into town. She tied off the muslin, sat back on her heels. He flexed his fingers once, testing, and looked at the bandage like a man checking a fence line after a storm. Not for pain, just to see what it held. "Should have ducked," he said. "Should have told me they were coming," she said. Neither of those was true, exactly, and both of them knew it, and the coffee pot on the stove inside had gone cold sometime around 3 in the morning, and neither of them had thought to mind. It would take some telling how they'd gotten to this step, this arm, this bread cooling over a bullet's path. It would take going back 3 weeks to a counter in the general store and 4 plain words spoken over a sack of flour before either of them had any reason to sit this close in the gray part of the morning, saying nothing, meaning most of it anyway. 3 weeks before that morning, she came in on the noon train with a trunk, a rolling pin wrapped in a shawl, and no one to meet her. Larkspur Hollow had a way of looking at a stranger without seeming to look. Men on the feed store porch found reasons to study their boots. A woman in a gray bonnet crossed to the far side of the street, unhurried, as if the crossing had nothing to do with her at all. The depot agent handed down her trunk and did not offer to carry it further. She carried it herself, 3 blocks, to the bakehouse at the corner of 2nd and Church. The building had been shut 2 winters. The windows were furred with dust on the inside, so that the light coming through them looked strained, like milk gone thin. She stood on the step a long moment before she put the key in, a key the land office had given her without ceremony, as if handing off a debt nobody wanted collected. Inside, the ovens were cold in a way that felt older than 2 winters. Ash sat undisturbed in the firebox, gray and settled, and the flour bins along the back wall held only a fine gray dust that was not flour anymore but the memory of it. A wooden spoon stood upright in a crock, forgotten mid-use by hands that would not come back for it. She did not ask the town about the woman who had run the ovens before her. She did not have to. It came to her anyway, in pieces, the way such things always do, over the mercantile counter, behind a hand at the fence line, in the particular silence that fell when she introduced herself as new to town and gave her name and said nothing else. A woman had died here of fever 2 winters back, after her husband had ridden off with money that wasn't his and never come home to answer for it. The ovens had gone cold with her. Nobody said it plainly. Nobody had to. She understood, within her first week, that she was not just taking over a building. She was standing in a debt the town had never finished being angry about, and she was doing it alone, a widow, with a rolling pin, and a trunk, and no husband of her own to answer for anything, which some of them seemed to hold against her all the same. She swept the ash out herself. She scrubbed the flour bins with vinegar water until her hands cracked in the cold. She built the first fire on a Tuesday morning, with kindling she'd split herself, and stood before the oven door waiting to see if the flue still drew, and if the whole enterprise might yet fail before it began. It drew. Smoke rose thin and gray against a colder sky, and somewhere down the street, a curtain moved back into place. The oven drew fine that first morning, but by the second week the wind had shifted, and with it came a problem she hadn't the tools to name. Smoke backed into the room instead of climbing the flue. It sat low and stung her eyes, and left a film on the windows that she scrubbed off twice a day. She tried packing the flue with rags. She tried a shorter fire, a hotter fire, propping the door at different angles. Each time the smoke came back into the room, like something that had decided to live there. She was standing on an overturned crate, arm deep in the flue with a rag wrapped around her hand, when she heard boots on the boardwalk outside, and did not turn around, because she had learned already that most footsteps in this town did not stop for her. These did. He came around the side of the building without knocking, the way a man does who has some working reason to be there and no interest in explaining it. He wore a star that looked like it had been pinned on more out of habit than ceremony, and a coat gone pale at the shoulders from sun. He didn't ask if she needed help. He looked up at the chimney from outside, head tilted, the way another man might study a horse's gait for a limp. "Bird's nest, likely," he said. "Or the cap's cracked. Wind's coming down wrong." She climbed off the crate. "I hadn't thought to check the cap." He didn't answer that either. He found the ladder leaned against the woodshed, tested the first 2 rungs with his boot before trusting his weight to them, and went up onto the roof without asking permission to. She stood below with flour on her forearms and listened to him move over the shingles, slow and unhurried, the sound of something being pried loose, then silence, then a scrape of stone or a broken clay tile falling into the yard. When he came back down, the chimney breathed clean. She built the fire again to test it, and the smoke rose straight this time, thin and obedient, out into a sky the color of dishwater. She turned to thank him properly. She had already decided on the words, something about owing him for his trouble. But he was already past the corner of the building, moving toward the road with the particular economy of a man who had somewhere else to be, and no interest in being paid in words for a favor that had cost him 10 minutes. "Obliged," she called after him, because it was the only version of thanks she managed to get out in time. He lifted 2 fingers off his hat brim without turning around, and kept walking, boots quiet on the frozen ruts of the road, toward the edge of town where the herd line ran, and the cattle stood steaming in the cold, and nobody yet had thought to wonder why the rustling had stopped for exactly as long as it had. The general store smelled of coffee beans and lamp oil, and the particular dust that settled over everything by midweek. She had come for flour, 2 sacks, and a tin of baking soda, and had set both on the counter, with the coins counted out exact, the way she counted everything, now that counting was a thing she had to do herself. The owner weighed the flour slower than the scale required. "Heard you got the chimney drawing again," he said, not looking up. "I did." "Lucky." He said it the way a man says a word he does not believe. Ovens are particular things. Woman running them alone, particular things go wrong. Behind her, a rancher's wife was turning over spools of thread without buying any, and she said, to no one exactly, "Some things go wrong on their own. Some things get helped along." The words landed the way they were meant to. She kept her hands still on the counter and did not turn. "I only bake bread," she said. So did she. The rancher's wife nodded toward the empty lot 2 doors down, where the old bakehouse had stood before this one, and let the sentence finish itself in the space where the woman used to be. Nobody in the store said the dead husband's name, or the money he had taken with him, or the rustling that had paid for his leaving, but the shape of it sat in the room anyway, the way smoke sits in a house after the fire is out. She reached for her flour sacks. Her chin did not move. The door opened behind her, cold air first, then boots, then the deputy, hat still wet at the brim from the morning's thaw. He set a box of shells on the counter and did not look at either woman directly, which was its own kind of looking. "Herd's been hit twice this month," he said to the store owner, though the room heard it plain. "Past midnight, both times. Whoever's doing it knows which nights the watch is thin." The rancher's wife found something urgent in her thread again. He turned then, unhurried, and looked at the flour sacks on the counter, and at her hands beside them. "You'll be baking late on delivery nights," he said. Not a question. "I will. I'll take the porch those nights. Rifle across my knees. Nothing more than that." He said it the way he'd said everything since the chimney, plain, costless to himself in the telling, though she understood already it would cost him something in the town's eyes to be seen standing watch over a widow's ovens. "And in trade?" "You cook, I shoot." He picked up his shells. "Bread and coffee's fair enough." The store owner said nothing. The rancher's wife said nothing. She looked at the deputy's steady, unremarkable face, and found in it none of the calculation the room around her was so full of. "Coffee," she said. "I can manage." He touched his hat brim and was gone, before the bell above the door had finished its sound, leaving her alone at the counter with 2 sacks of flour and a silence that had, for the first time since she'd arrived in Larkspur Hollow, something other than suspicion in it. The first night he came was a Tuesday, and he came without being told which nights those would be, as if he had already worked it out from the delivery schedule chalked on the store window. He carried a rifle broken over his arm, and a chair he did not ask to borrow, taking the one from beside her door and setting it at an angle that let him see both the road and the dark break of the tree line behind the bakehouse. She watched him from the window a moment before she went back to the dough. He said nothing about the hour, nothing about the cold, nothing about the fact that the whole of Larkspur Hollow would know by morning that the deputy had sat a widow's porch through the night. He simply sat, and the rifle went across his knees, and that was the whole of it. She baked. The ovens took the chill off the back room and pushed it out under the door, in a thin orange line that fell across his boots. She did not speak to him through the wall. There was nothing yet between them that required speaking. At midnight she brought out coffee because it seemed a discourteous thing not to, and found he took it black until she asked, and then admitted, only when pressed, to 1 exact spoon of sugar, no more. She did not ask why he'd waited to say so. She only remembered it, and after that the sugar was already in the cup before she carried it out. He did not thank her extravagantly. He said, "Obliged," the way a man says a word he has used 1,000 times and worn smooth, and went back to watching the tree line. By the third night this had become, without either of them naming it, a shape the evening took. She baked. He sat. Around 1 in the morning she brought the coffee, and sometimes a heel of bread still warm enough to soften the butter, and he ate it, standing at the porch rail, with his eyes still on the dark, never quite turning his back to the road, even to eat. The town noticed, as towns do. She heard it in the pause before the store owner's wife greeted her. In the particular way the rancher's hired hands looked at the bakehouse porch when they rode past of an evening, and saw the shape of a man in the chair, with a rifle laid crosswise. No one said anything to her face. She had not expected they would. She kept baking. He kept watching. The arrangement asked nothing of either of them, beyond what had been said once at the counter. And there was something in that plainness she found she did not want disturbed. Not by gratitude, not by curiosity, not by anything that might turn a simple trade into a debt neither of them had agreed to owe. The first week she made the coffee the way most people took it. A spoonful stirred in without asking. He drank it anyway, both nights, and said nothing, and she might never have known if she had not come out early one evening to find him already on the porch, stirring his own cup at the rail, with a single measured spoon, lifted and leveled off against the rim before he tipped it in. She watched from the doorway a moment. The next night she made it his way, set the cup down without comment. He looked at it, then at her, and something in his face eased that she would not have called a smile, but was closer to one than anything he'd shown her yet. Neither of them mentioned it after that. She simply kept to the one measure, and he simply kept drinking it, and it became one more thing folded into the shape the evenings took. He noticed things too, in his slow way, the chain at her collar, and what hung from it, a ring, plain gold, worn thin on one edge, the way a ring gets worn when it has spent years on a hand doing work. She never wore it on her finger. He never asked why, but he saw her touch it sometimes without seeming to know she was doing it, in the pause between pulling a tray from the oven and setting it on the rail to cool, and he filed that the way he filed everything, without remark. It was the boy from next door who broke the quiet of the porch first, though he did it without words too. He came around the side of the bakehouse one morning not long after, small and barefoot despite the cold, and stood at the bottom of the steps with the particular patience of a child who has decided something is his by right without having asked. She had the burnt heel of the morning's first loaf in her hand. The end she always cut away and set aside, too dark for selling. She looked at him. He looked at the bread. She held it out. He took it and ran. The next morning he was there again, at the same hour, same spot, and the morning after that. She began cutting the heel a little more generously. He began arriving a little more punctually, as if the sun itself had started keeping his schedule for him. Neither she nor the deputy remarked on it when their evenings and the boy's mornings happened to overlap, when he'd come around the corner still rubbing sleep from his eyes, to find a rifle propped against the porch rail and a man rising stiff from a chair that had held him half the night. The boy never asked about the rifle. The deputy never asked about the boy. It became, like the sugar, like the ring left silent at her throat, one more thing that lived in the bakehouse without being spoken of, a small ritual, stitched into the larger one, another quiet fact the town could watch and wonder at from a safe distance, and never once ask her to explain. The boy's mother came by on a Tuesday, ostensibly for a half loaf and a paper of pins, and stayed leaning on the counter long after the pins were bagged. She was a woman built for staying, thick through the shoulders, with the particular patience of someone who had raised 4 children and buried none of them, and she talked the way some women knit, without appearing to notice she was doing it. She talked about the weather and the price of salt, and then, without any bridge that could be pointed to afterward, about the woman who had run the ovens before. "Fever!" everyone said. That was the word the town had settled on, the way a town settles on a word for a thing it does not want to look at directly. But the mother's voice dropped a register, confidential, not unkind, and she said fever was only the last of it. Said the woman's husband had run off 2 winters before, with money that wasn't his to run off with. Rustled stock, sold quiet 3 counties over, and left her to the ovens and the debts both. And that a woman alone with debts and an oven does not so much catch a fever as get caught by one, because there is no one left to notice she has stopped eating. She said it and moved on to the price of salt again, as if she had not said it at all. She did not know why she was being told this, or perhaps she knew exactly why, and only understood the knowing afterward, alone in the kitchen, with the dough gone quiet under its cloth. This is why they watch, she thought. not because of anything she had done. Because of a shape they already recognized, a shape a woman alone at an oven could grow into if no one minded her, and once grown into it, could not climb back out of. She did not tell the deputy. There was nothing in it that was hers to tell, and nothing in it that changed what he did on the porch 3 nights a week, rifle across his knees. But that evening, after the last loaf came out, and the boy had come and gone with his heel of bread, she found herself standing at the flour bin longer than she needed to, turning the little brass hook at its lid, testing it. It had never occurred to her to lock it. Flour was flour, worth stealing to no one who wasn't hungry, and hungry people she'd have fed for free. But she locked it that night, and did not examine too closely what she thought the lock was for, and in the morning found herself checking it again, before she'd even lit the stove, her fingers going to the hook, the way another woman's fingers might go to a door latch, in a house that had once, long ago, been broken into. He came the next evening with his hat still on, which was how she knew before he said anything. He took it off once he was through the door, the way he always did, but the delay told her something had happened between the herd line and her porch that he hadn't yet decided how to carry. She set the coffee down. 1 measure of sugar, stirred in before she brought it to him, so he wouldn't have to ask. "Lost 3 head off the north pasture," he said. 2 nights running now. She stood with a cloth in her hand, not moving to wipe anything with it. Same as before? Same cut fence. Same time near on midnight. He turned the cup a quarter turn on the table without drinking from it. Except this time they didn't bother hiding the tracks going out, like they weren't worried who followed. She thought of the lock on the flour bin, the brass hook worn smooth already from 3 days of her own checking. "That means something," she said. It wasn't a question, not really, and he didn't treat it as one. "Means they know when the line's watched and when it isn't." He looked at her now, not around the room, not at his hands. "Means they know which nights I'm here, instead of out there." The kitchen was quiet enough that she heard the stove ticking as it cooled. "You told anyone your schedule," she said. "Told the sheriff. Told you." He said it plainly, no accusation in it, but she felt the weight of the short list all the same. Nobody else has cause to know it. She thought of the boy who came for the burnt heel, of the women at the counter who counted her flour sacks with their eyes, of how small a town was when it wanted to know something about a person it had already decided to distrust. "You think it's someone here," she said. "In Larkspur." "I think whoever's doing it isn't guessing." He drank from the cup at last, set it down. "Rustling's patient work when you don't know a place. This isn't patient. This is somebody who already knows where the gaps are." She untied her apron out of habit, more to give her hands something to do than because the work was finished. Outside the window the light was going the color it went before dark fully arrived, gray settling into the yard, into the fence line, into the shape of the road that led out toward the herds he watched over on the nights he wasn't watching her instead. "Then whoever it is," she said, "already knows you'll be here Thursday." He didn't answer that directly. He only looked toward the door, toward the porch beyond it, the way a man looks at ground he's already decided he isn't leaving. She went back to the counter because there was nothing left to do there, and did it anyway. Flour dusted the board in a thin skin, and she smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, though no dough waited to be turned. It was a habit from the years before this one, from a kitchen in another town, the kind of motion a body keeps long after the reason for it is gone. She reached for the shelf where the cups hung on their hooks, took down 2, and set them by the stove without thinking about it at all. It was only when she lifted the coffee pot that she saw what she'd done. 1 cup was already half full, steam climbing off it slow in the cooling air, sitting where she must have poured it without deciding to. She stood with the pot in her hand and looked at it the way she might look at something that had wandered into the kitchen on its own. He was still by the window. She didn't know if he'd seen. Then she looked up and found that he had. He didn't say anything. He was turning his hat once between his hands, slow, the way a man turns something over when he wants his hands occupied, and his face still. His eyes went from the cup to her and back to the cup, and something in the line of his jaw eased, just slightly, the way rope gives an inch under a weight it was already prepared to hold. She set the pot down harder than she needed to. "Habit," she said. Didn't say a word. You didn't have to. He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, just moved through the corner of his mouth and was gone, the way weather moves through a valley without ever quite reaching the house. He set his hat back on the peg by the door instead of on his head, which meant he wasn't leaving yet, and crossed back to the chair he'd pulled near the stove 3 weeks running now, and sat, and picked up the cup she hadn't meant to pour. He drank from it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Maybe to him it was. She turned back to the board and found something to do with the flour that didn't need doing, because her hands wanted work and her face didn't want to be looked at just then. Outside, the gray had gone to blue, and the blue was going the way it did before full dark. And somewhere past the fence line, the herd shifted and settled the way cattle did when nothing was wrong yet. She didn't look at him again for a while. He didn't seem to need her to. The coffee sat between them, and the second cup, poured for no reason she could name, cooled slowly on the counter where she'd left it, untouched, and neither of them moving to pour it out. She banked the stove low for the night and set the dough to rise under a cloth, the way she did every delivery night, and the smell of it filled the kitchen slow and warm, the way bread did before it became bread. He'd taken his chair on the porch by then, rifle across his knees, the way he did 3 nights a week, and she'd stopped thinking of it as strange months ago, though she still noticed it, the way you notice a fence post you pass every day, and would miss if it were gone. Midnight came without announcing itself. She was rolling the second batch when she heard the hoofbeats. Fast. Not the loose, uneven gait of cattle moving themselves along a line, but riders, more than one, coming hard. She went still with her hands in the dough. The sound didn't bend toward the herd line the way trouble usually did. It came around instead, past the fence, past the well, curving behind the bakehouse the way a man walks a house he means to enter from the side no one's watching. On the porch, he was already up. She heard the chair scrape back, heard the small metallic sound of the rifle coming off his knees and into his hands, and she understood before he said anything that he'd heard it too, the wrongness of the direction, the way the sound wasn't going where sound was supposed to go on a night like this. He didn't call out. He moved toward the side of the house, unhurried in the way he was always unhurried, but she saw through the window that his jaw had set, and that his eyes were doing the fast, small work of counting, riders, distance, the dark shape of the porch rail between himself and whatever was coming. She thought of the herd, 3 weeks of watching it, 3 weeks of him sitting out there so the herd would be safe, and in the same breath she understood, with the flat certainty of something arriving too late to be useful, that the herd had never been the point tonight. They weren't riding for the cattle. They were riding to see if the porch would be empty. Someone had told them the pattern, which nights, which hours, how reliably a deputy sat with a rifle across his knees instead of walking the line. Someone had handed them the shape of the arrangement itself, the plain bargain of it, and turned it into a door. She set the dough down without covering it. Outside, the hoofbeats slowed, then split. One rider peeling toward the fence, 2 more coming on toward the house, toward the porch, toward the space where a rifle was supposed to not be. She heard him say her name once, low, not a question. She was already moving toward the door when the first shot cracked the dark open. The latch was still swinging when he crossed in front of her. He did it without a word, the way he might step ahead of her on an icy step, except this time his hand found the door frame and his body found the space where the window opened onto the porch, and he did not look back to see if she understood why. The lamp on the table guttered, caught by the draft, and steadied. She heard the second shot before she understood the first had already happened. It came through the window in a sound she would not have known to call small if she had not lived through it. Glass gone, then something duller, a chip jumping off the sill in a spray of white paint and old wood, missing the cooling loaves by the width of a hand. He returned fire twice. She counted it later, lying awake, the way a person counts anything to keep from counting something else. 2 shots, flat and close, and then men's voices outside, urgent, not his, and the sound of horses turning hard on packed dirt, the particular violence of an animal wheeling under a rider who has decided, abruptly, that the cost has changed. Then nothing. The nothing went on long enough that she thought she should be doing something with it, and could not think what. He lowered the rifle first. She saw that before she saw anything else, the barrel coming down, his shoulders dropping half an inch, the whole shape of him changing from a thing braced to a thing merely standing. He turned his head toward her the way he might check a level, some habit of care that had nothing to do with what had just happened, and everything to do with who he was. That was when she saw the tear in his coat sleeve, dark at the edge, darker beneath. She crossed the room without deciding to. Her hand went to his back first, flat, low, between the shoulder blades, the place a person touches another person to know they are still standing. And only after that did she reach for his arm, turning it toward the lamp, working the torn wool back from the skin. The graze ran shallow, a red line more than a wound, the kind of hurt that would ache for a week and mean nothing after. He didn't pull away from her hands. He watched her work at the sleeve, the way he watched the road at night, steady, unhurried, as if the thing in front of him required his full attention and nothing else. Outside, the yard had gone quiet in the particular way a place goes quiet after violence has passed through it and left the dark undisturbed, as though nothing had happened at all, except for the bread cooling 3 inches from a splintered sill, and the 2 of them standing in the lamplight, neither one letting go first. She tore the strip from her own apron, the hem she'd hemmed twice already that month, and wound it twice around his forearm, tucking the end under itself the way she tucked dough under a proofing cloth, without ceremony, because ceremony was not what the moment wanted. He flexed his hand once the binding held, testing it, not wincing. They went out to the step, because the kitchen had grown too small for the 2 of them, and the lamp and the quiet, and because the bread still needed the cool morning air to finish what the oven had started. The sky over Larkspur Hollow was doing what it did every dawn whether or not a thing had happened in the night, going gray, then pale gold at the rim of the herd line, indifferent and exact. Smoke was starting from a chimney down the row. A dog barked once and gave up. He sat with his rifle across his knees out of habit more than need now. The danger passed, the yard empty of anything but hoofprints that would be gone by noon, under wagon wheels and gossip. She brought the coffee without a word, 1 cup for him with the one exact measure of sugar he never asked for, 1 for herself black, and set his down on the step beside his boot before he could reach for it. He looked at the cup, then at her. Neither said anything about that. The child's mother came around the corner of the lane earlier than usual, a shawl thrown over her nightdress, her face already arranged for alarm before she saw them. The deputy with his arm bound in a strip of apron cloth, the widow beside him, with flowers still pale on her knuckles, both of them simply sitting, unhurried, 2 cups steaming between them like the most ordinary thing in the world. She stopped at the gate, looked from one to the other. Neither of them explained. After a moment, the woman's face settled into something less like alarm and more like understanding, and she said only that she supposed the child would be along soon for the heel of the loaf, and turned back toward her own gate, and did not ask what had happened in the night, because by supper she would know, and by morning the rest of the town would too, and none of it needed saying now. The bread sat cooling on the sill where the bullet had passed near it, a small furrow in the wood that would stay there through every loaf baked after. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The town went on waking around them, unhurried, the way mornings do, and neither one moved to go inside, and neither one reached for the other's hand, and the second cup sat there, already poured, the way it would be poured tomorrow, and the day after that, without either of them needing to ask.